throwing his hat back in the ring. You have the Democratic candidate Wilson, and you have the Socialist candidate Eugene V. Debs. Wilson wins a divided field. Remember, he wins with about 42% of the popular vote. Though Wilson was elected out of New Jersey, he was actually a native Southerner. He was born in Stanton, Virginia. It looks like Stanton, but it's kind of Stanton. And grew up largely in the South. And one of the leaders of the Presbyterian Church in America, which meant Wilson will always have kind of a strong moralistic streak in him because of that. And his Southern background is also going to influence the way he treats black Americans. Despite the fact he's considered a great president, a great progressive, he was one of the racist presidents of the 20th century. He knew personal tragedy as a president. In August of 1914, his wife dies of kidney failure. He will also be one of the few presidents to be married while president. He will remarry. In December of 1915, he will marry the wealthy, influential Virginia widow, Edith Bulling. And by the way, Wilson, people admired Wilson. They respected him. A lot of people feared him. But he wasn't Mr. Warmth. Unlike Taft, who was outgoing, had a good sense of humor, loved people, Wilson was kind of standoffish in public, more of an authority figure than a peer. So in many ways he seemed somewhat less approachable than previous presidents like TR or Taft. His courtship of Edith Bulling while he was president helped humanize him in the eyes of the American public. Here's a president that had suffered a great personal tragedy and was now in the middle of a romantic adventure. So the newspapers covered it, front page news, quite frankly. But he's one of the few presidents to be married or remarried while in the White House. Good morning. Good morning. Talking about Woodrow Wilson. Now, his remarriage is somewhat important, not just for his mental health and his morale and his love life. It's going to have implications for the nation. Toward the end of his second term, at the end of World War I, Wilson will have a major stroke. It's after the Treaty of Versailles. Back then, we did not have the Presidential Succession Amendment that would have allowed the Vice President to take over because the President was incapacitated. So for several months while he was recuperating, Edith Bulling Wilson was basically the de facto President of the United States. So in many ways, we've already had a woman president. Not officially, of course. Here's Edith Bulling Wilson. By the way, Woodrow Wilson was one of the first presidents to own and drive his own car as president. Back then, you could actually do that. Today, if the president decided to jump behind the wheel of his car, people would freak out. He has to be in a chauffeured limousine followed by security. Back then, Wilson could basically get in his car and drive around Washington if he wanted to. If you go to the museum in Stanton, Virginia, his museum, they've got his car on display. And it's a huge Packard. I mean, things looks about as big as a semi, not quite, but probably from that window to you, right there. That car's about that long. Huge thing. But he was one of the first presidents to have a driver's license and the first to really drive around Washington. He actually had little formal political experience before becoming president. By career, he was a history professor. He's the only PhD we've ever had as president. He was professor of history and political science at Princeton University. And he eventually became president of Princeton. Turned it into the powerhouse school it is today, the high academic standards it has today. That landed him the job of governor of New Jersey. And he did something almost unprecedented. He cleaned up the government of New Jersey, rooted out corruption, made it more efficient, brought a whirlwind of progressive reform to that state. In 2 years, he revolutionized New Jersey. That's what propelled him into the presidency. So he only had 2 years of political experience before he became president. His background, however, as a history professor and political scientist, served him in good stead. His specialty was political history, expert on Congress. He'd written books about it. A lot of Congress people don't read because in one of his books he compared Congress to the British Parliament and decided that Parliament is Congress. So he understood how the legislative branch worked, even though he had never served in it. In fact, he will be one of the most successful presidents when it comes to packaging and getting legislation passed by Congress. He has an amazing record on what he gets done. Probably the only 2 presidents that got more legislation passed and were as adept at handling Congress were probably Franklin Roosevelt and then Lyndon Johnson. Knowing how Congress works goes a long way to actually getting your agenda enacted. Presidents that don't understand Congress aren't usually very successful. He did understand it. He knew how to package legislation. And he will get a hell of a lot done. Now, he has his faults. As I pointed out, he's racist. He's stubborn, he's moralistic, and often unable to see other people's point of view. But all those other skills I mentioned will help make him one of the great presidents of the 20th century. Now, if Teddy had his square deal, Wilson had his new freedom. It became common after Teddy Roosevelt for a lot of presidents to have a catch. New freedom is like that. A lot of the political catch, they sound good, but what do they really mean? What they really mean is they want you to vote for them, and they're not going to give you a straight answer on what they're going to do. But now, Wilson was kind of lucky in a way. The groundwork had been laid for him for progressive reform. Even though Roosevelt and our moderate progressive Taft had failed to get much progressive legislation passed, they do set the table for Wilson. He inherits a Congress that, though it's somewhat controlled by the conservative wing of the Democratic Party now, is still more amenable to passing reform legislation, progressive legislation. So it's not only his skill that does it, it's also the fact that he's got a friendlier Congress to work with. And in part, he engineers that. Oh, one other thing I want to point out that he did, kind of following up on Teddy Roosevelt, it's Wilson that inaugurated the weekly press conference, which sadly is no longer going on with the current administration. But beginning with Wilson, every president held weekly press conferences. We talked today about transparency. This is an early attempt at it. And by the way, hopefully you're not too squeamish, but history is sometimes very ugly. When I talk about Wilson's racism, this sadly was one of the most racist periods in American history. The early 1900s, through the Wilson administration, saw more lynchings in American history than any other era. And the vast majority of the victims were innocent of any real crime. So I know that's disturbing, but some parts of history are, folks.
Is that done by the police, right?
No, it's done by a lot of the smiling people in that crowd. And those people did not get it wrong. And I'm pretty sure, based on what I know about this picture, they weren't actually guilty of any crime. They were falsely accused. Their real crime was being uppity, challenging the white establishment. We'll go back to the white establishment. Now, Wilson begins his reform program immediately. He calls Congress into special session and charges them with tariff and banking reform. The result is the Underwood Tariff. It lowers an extremely high tariff. The American tariff had been a protective tariff, remember? To protect American industry. Wilson gets that lowered. Now, what section of the nation is that going to please the most? Thank you. Way to go. You remembered. The South. They're not a manufacturing region back then. So they prefer cheap imported goods. Now, Wilson did this on purpose. Remember, the Southern congressmen are the most conservative. He wants to win them over to his progressive reform agenda. And he figured the best way to do that is give them something up front at first that'll make them happy. And the Underwood Tariff did that. After that, they were far more willing to vote for his progressive agenda. So I wouldn't say he manipulated them, but he won them over would probably be a better way to say it. And also that first year, he oversaw the creation of the Federal Reserve System, the current system we have to stabilize our economic and monetary structure. Between Andrew Jackson's destruction of the second bank of the United States in the late 1820s and the creation of the Federal Reserve, American money policy had been chaotic. And it had led to boom and bust cycles, as many of you folks that suffered through me earlier know. The economy would go rip-roaring, expanding like hell, and then all of a sudden you'd have a major depression. And then the process would start over again. The Fed was a major step in reducing that cycle, especially the bust part of the cycle. And it is still the basis of our economic system today. Wilson also institutes somewhat of a new tradition for presidents. Thomas Jefferson hated public speaking. He was a genius, but he hated to speak in public. He gave his initial State of the Union address in 1801 and decided after that to mail it into Congress. Every president from Jefferson, 1801, to Wilson in 1913 sent their State of the Union address to Congress as a letter, a formal letter. They did not get up in front of Congress and actually deliver it. Wilson's the first president, and it has now become tradition, hasn't it? I found it interesting in the most recent controversy with the shutdown of the government and the postponement of President Trump's State of the Union address. A lot of people don't realize, what does the Constitution say about the State of the Union? Found it interesting. A lot of people were vehemently arguing certain points of view, and they had no idea what they were talking about. All the Constitution says is that the President will inform Congress on the State of the Union on occasion. It doesn't say it has to be annually. It doesn't say it has to be in person. That's just become tradition because of Wilson. By the way, Teddy Roosevelt thought that Wilson's addressing Congress in person was a brilliant idea. When somebody asked him about it, he said, "I wish I would have thought of that." So that's why presidents today address Congress personally. Now, Wilson was a little different than most progressives. He kind of agreed with the old populist. He would rather destroy the corporations. But he settled for regulation. Probably a good idea. And much of his legislation protected workers in various industries. One of the other things you begin to see with the progressive movement when it comes to legislation, and you'll see it later in the New Deal, and it's common now in the government and legislation, is passing legislation to protect specific segments of American society. That had been done before, of course, but it's going to have greater emphasis and more specific groups. For example, in 1915, the La Follette-Siemens Act, sponsored by Senator La Follette. It establishes minimum safety standards on American merchant ships and protected the basic rights for sailors. Now, that's important back then because, at least then, the United States had the largest merchant marine in the world. We don't anymore, unfortunately. We had a lot of ships, but they usually sail under foreign flags to avoid American regulation. I think half the ships registered to Panama are owned actually by United States companies. But these regulations provided much needed safety regulations on ships and protected their civil rights. Up to that point, if a sailor jumped ship, basically walked off the job, well, you didn't do it out to sea, you'd have to swim off the job, but if you were aboard, you could get arrested for that. You can't get arrested if you decide you don't want a factory job and walk off. They're not going to arrest you, they're going to fire you. They're not going to arrest you for it, right? In 1916, the Adamson Act. It mandated an 8-hour workday for railroad workers. And again, that was important for a lot of reasons. One, it's a huge safety measure for railroad workers. They did studies and found out that the vast majority of railroad accidents occurred after the worker had been on the job for 8 hours. And railroad work was dangerous. Back then, they did not have automatic couplers, hold the cars together. You actually had to have somebody in there and get the hell out of the way quick enough so they didn't get squished. And most of those accidents happened after somebody had been on the job 9 or 10 hours. The other reason it's important, back then the railroad industry was still the single largest industry in America, the largest single employer. So if the railroad industry adopts something, it has a ripple effect. Other industries eventually adopt it, such as the steel industry. There's another very dangerous. One of the major, the most heartfelt of the progressive concerns was the elimination of child labor. Children were being horribly abused by American industry, working in factories 10, 12 hours a day under extremely dangerous conditions. Again, this is my day for disturbing photos. Here are a couple of kids working in a textile factory. They used them like that because most of those machines aren't self-lubricating. So those kids had to stand on moving machines and reach in there and oil them and lubricate them when they're moving. They preferred little kids because they had smaller hands and they were quicker. But if Junior doesn't get his hand out of there quick enough, it's mangled for life. The number of children maimed or killed on the job back then was horrifying. In 1916, under Wilson's leadership, Congress passes the Keating-Owens Act. First attempt to ban child labor. It banned from interstate commerce any product made in a factory employing children under 14. Bless you. The law was overturned by the Supreme Court. A year later, a very conservative Supreme Court strikes down the Keating-Owens Act, saying it violated a child's right to work. Future courts, in greater wisdom, will reverse that decision, largely based on the fact that minors don't have the legal right to make certain decisions, do they? By the way, parents that sued not 2 years after the aftermath of the Civil War. You're going to see the same thing progressively. You're going to have 4 new amendments passed within about a 7-year period. The first is the 16th Amendment, and that was actually passed under the Taft administration. And the closer we get to April, the less we think of this as a great reform. Income tax. It's the 16th Amendment that legalized the income tax. Now keep in mind, the progressives didn't have us in mind when they passed the tax. It was a tax on the wealthy. Ironically, the last Congress felt sorry for those poor, suffering billionaires and gave them a huge tax break, didn't they? Oh, poor babies. The progressives would have been shocked at that, hated it. They believed the wealthy should pay their fair share. And that we, the average person, unless there are any billionaires out there that I don't know about, I apologize. By the way, if there's any billionaires out there, come and see me after class.
No offense,
Thank you. Oh, that's your Ferrari out there, huh? I wish, huh? Where the hell? Oh, okay. It was a tax on the rich, folks. And it was not even that heavy back then. It was only 1% on incomes of $5,000 a year or more. 1%. The highest rate was only 6%. That was on fortunes of $500,000 or more. I don't know about you folks, but I'd be happy to pay my 6%. What is it now? Closer to like 30% or something. So the point is, the majority of Americans did not have to pay an income tax. That doesn't change until World War II, when the government needs money to fight the war. 17th Amendment, passed shortly after Wilson became president, was a direct election of U.S. senators by voters and not the state legislatures. Remember, that had been an old populist concern, had it, along with income tax for that matter. For the first time in history, we could vote directly for the senators representing our state. The 18th Amendment, my least favorite of all the amendments, passed in 1919, prohibition, the so-called noble experiment to ban the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcohol. It may have been noble, but it certainly was naive and doomed to failure, as we shall see. It will also be the only amendment, so far anyway, in American history that will be repealed. And the 19th Amendment, 1920, women's suffrage. Women finally, nationally, get the right to vote. Now, women have been allowed to vote at varying levels anyway in many states. There were two types of advocates for women's suffrage. One were suffragists, which believed in doing it through a legal way and through persuasion. And then there were the more radical suffragettes. They believed in civil disobedience and basically doing whatever necessary to undermine a system that was oppressing them. In England, a lot of the suffragettes actually bombed places, and one of them accidentally killed herself by throwing herself in front of the king's horse at the largest horse race in England. I don't know why she thought the horse would be able to stop in time, but it trampled her. Made her a martyr, helped make her point in England. So anyway, there was a difference. In America, we tended to have more suffragists than suffragettes. But they did work hand in hand. It was a matter of degree. They tended to be more radical. No. Because he doesn't have long enough flagpole. Like many reform groups, to point out that they are patriotic, that all they're doing is trying to get their just rights as American citizens. So they weren't meaning any disrespect. She just needed to be taller, I guess. But thank you for bringing that up. And as I pointed out, women could vote to varying degrees before 1920. And by the way, notice what region was actually the most enlightened when it came to women's suffrage? It's the West, isn't it? There are a couple of reasons for that. One, taming the West was a partnership. It took men and women to do it. And secondly, a lot of those states didn't have a large population. You needed 60,000 registered voters to apply for statehood. Some of these territories out here, like New Mexico, Arizona, Wyoming, and all that, it would have been decades before they would have had enough male voters. So if they had statehood, they basically had two choices: let cattle vote or let women vote. And since cattle are notoriously fickle and uninformed voters, they decided to let women vote. But that's one reason. One was a greater sense of egalitarianism, took both genders to build the West. The other reason was you needed a certain amount of voters to apply for statehood. Now that doesn't apply to all Western states, California, Oregon and all, they were already states. But it's interesting, the West does lead the way when it comes to women's rights. What region was way behind? The South, yeah. You see a pattern? When I talk about civil rights later on, it'll be the South. Not picking on them. My wife's a native Southerner, and she gets mad at me when I do that. Now, Wilson, the great progressive, had actually avoided endorsing women's suffrage for many years. Like many politicians, he didn't want to get stuck in the middle of a highly divisive issue. And like many, his argument was, well, that was something that should be decided at the state level. You hear that about a lot of controversial issues today, don't you? Kind of passing the buck. A lot of these issues can only be dealt with at a federal level. Now, he had supported women's suffrage at the state level, but he was reluctant to do it because his own party was divided on it, the South. Finally, in January of 1918, for the first time, he publicly supports women's suffrage. It does help. The very next day, the House will vote 274 to 136 in favor of the amendment. Why is that vote important? 274 to 136.
Why is it important?
Yeah.
It's a big, it's just a large amount of people voted against it. Kind of crazy.
Actually, Mac, it's amazing how sexist some of the guys were back then.
That's why I think it's okay.
No.
Probably wrong. That's what I meant.
It's exactly 2/3, isn't it? What do you need? What does Congress have to do to pass a proposed congressional amendment? They need a 2/3 vote. One congressperson would have voted differently, voted against it, it would have failed. It was that close, is my point. No margin for error. And Wilson will later address the Senate and personally argue for the passage of the women's suffrage amendment. So he'll get on board, it'll just be late in the game. It's also in this era, back before the amendment is passed, that the first woman is elected to Congress. It's from one of the big square states out west that allowed women to vote in all elections, Montana. 3 years after they become a state. In April of 1917, they elect Republican Jeannette Rankin to the House of Representatives. Rankin becomes the first woman ever to sit in Congress. Excuse me. And by the way, within a few days of her being seated, she'll become one of the most controversial people in America. But we'll look at that a little bit down the road. But the reason she'll become controversial has to do with one of the deadliest wars in history that erupts at roughly the same time as Wilson's progressive reforms. Back then, they called it the Great War, then the World War, and after we have its sequel, the First World War. But initially it was known as the Great War. By 1914, Europe had not seen a major war in 100 years since the defeat of Napoleon. It hadn't all been peace and light. There had been a lot of little wars, especially in the Balkans. But by and large, the major powers in Europe had not fought each other in 100 years. Europe was prosperous, and it was an age of rapid technological and scientific advancement. Many believed they had entered a new era of enlightenment. And in the next 4 years, they're going to blow it to hell and back. Now, World War I is going to be caused by a lot of underlying causes. The first off is nationalism. Nationalism is a two-headed beast. On one hand, it's going to lead to the formation of several modern nations that had once been a conglomeration of separate kingdoms, principalities. Modern Italy, for example, modern Germany. But nationalism also has a dark side. Unlike patriotism, patriotism is love of your country and the ideals that your nation was built on. Nationalism is a lot more aggressive, militaristic, and threatening. It's your nation above all. You are superior. Sort of like Hitler in the Third Reich, that kind of thing. It goes beyond patriotism. Again, to use the Nazis as an example, they use nationalism to justify their program of Lebensraum, living space for the Germans, at the expense of the Poles and the Russians and everybody else they considered inferior. So nationalism can have a very evil edge. It's going to be one of the causes of World War I. A lot of these nations, especially the emerging ones, such as the German Empire, are going to try and increase their strength and their prestige at the expense of others. There's economic rivalry. People are prosperous. There's cutthroat trade wars between particularly Germany and Great Britain. The United States has become the preeminent industrial power in the world by then. But Germany and England weren't far behind. And they were fighting each other for supremacy in Europe and for much of world trade. There's rivalry for colonies around the world. Remember, this is the great age of imperialism. many of the emerging nations, such as Germany, got in the game late. They're very aggressive in trying to snatch colonies around the world, even from other people. That causes friction. There's military rivalry. On land, between hated enemies, France and Germany. German Empire had come together in the 1870s due to the Franco-Prussian War, when they launched a war on France and stole provinces from it, Alsace and Lorraine. So these two hated each other and were involved in a huge military buildup. There's a naval race between Great Britain and Germany. Both are busy building huge modern fleets. And Europe, by 1914, is divided into two rigid military alliances. The so-called Allied powers and the so-called Central powers. So despite the peace and prosperity, Europe was really a tinderbox by 1914. And an assassination is going to set it off. On June 28, 1914, on a state visit to Sarajevo, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, along with his wife, are assassinated by a Serbian terrorist, 19-year-old Gavrilo Princip. He's roughly your age, and God changes the world. I am not advocating you go out and shoot anybody. But he's 19 years old, he's a college student. He's a Serbian nationalist, belonged to an underground organization known as the Black Hand. And they thought by assassinating the Archduke, they could break off several parts of the Austrian Empire that had a majority, the so-called lost provinces. Their nationalist goal was to create a greater empire for the Serbs. And in Slavic, which I don't speak at all, that means Yugoslavia. You guys are probably too young to remember there once was a nation called Yugoslavia. The Serbs will actually get what they want, at least temporarily, until it all falls apart again anyway. Austria-Hungary is a decaying empire, and they feared nationalism. Their subject peoples, the Czechs, Hungarians, Slovenes, Poles, Serbs, all wanted to break free from the empire. They were afraid if the Serbs could do it, then everybody else would, and the empire would fall apart. By the way, Princip will be thrown in jail and die a few years later of tuberculosis. And he is now the national hero of Serbia, and there is a plaque commemorating the assassination right on the spot that he stood on. I'm kind of glad our national hero is someone like George Washington, and quite frankly, not an assassin. Here's the Archduke and his wife. And it's kind of ironic they shot him, because he was extremely enlightened and planned to give all the minorities in the empire a greater voice, turn it more into a federated country and less of an empire. He also was hated by the emperor for the simple reason he had married out of love. As a member of the Austrian royal family, he was obligated to marry a princess. And he married down. He married a mere countess. But at any rate, his kids weren't allowed to inherit the Austrian throne because of that. So he was a bit of a renegade. It would have been interesting. What the heck is that? I think the sun was reflecting. Put your phone down, and the sun was reflecting off of it.
Make sure that ringer was off.
I thought you were sending Morse code. And here they are shortly before they were assassinated. And here's the young assassin. When he touches off, can't really blame him. It probably would have happened one way or the other. But Austria, afraid of the Serbian example, decides to squash the tiny, which I already got rid of, tiny kingdom of Serbia. When they attack Serbia, Serbia's allies get in the war. Austria attacks Serbia. Russia declares war on Austria. Germany declares war on Austria. Germany declares war on France. Britain declares war on Germany and Austria. You got that? Within about 2 weeks, every major power in Europe is now at war. Most people were naive and thought it would be a relatively short war. After all, most of the previous ones were. The Germans thought they could defeat France in 6 weeks. They had a master plan to do that. It was known as the Schlieffen Plan, named after the German chief of staff that had developed it. The idea was to defeat France quickly, within 6 weeks, and then they could turn and destroy the lumbering Russian Empire. They believed correctly that Russia would take months before it was really ready to fight a war. They were right about that. They were wrong about that. They did not defeat France in 6 weeks. Not to go into it, I go into it in great detail when I teach my World War I class, but to make it short, the German army just couldn't move fast enough to do it. They're doing it in World War II, though. So at any rate, they managed to occupy big chunks of northern France, Belgium, but they don't defeat France. And it dooms them to a stalemate along the Western Front. 4 years of horrible carnage trying to break through the other side's trench lines. A bloody, murderous stalemate. This war will eventually kill 9 million people. This is a typical trench. This is what you would be living in on and off for several years. And of course, you're not alone. There's plenty of rats, lice, roaches, dead bodies to keep you company. And by the way, when it rains, it's a muddy morass and flooded at the bottom. And this is the aftermath of an attack on a trench, all the dead bodies. I guess today's disturbing photo day, huh? When the war breaks out, the United States was a neutral nation. Unlike today, we had no ties, no alliances with any other power. We were totally neutral. Wilson and the progressives in general hated war, and they had no desire to become involved in this one. And again, Teddy Roosevelt will prove to be the exception. Early on, he's pushing for United States entry into the war. But by and large, Wilson and the progressives wanted to avoid this at all costs. Wilson was aware that it would be difficult for many Americans to stay neutral. So on the 19th of August, 1914, at roughly the same time his wife is dying, so keep in mind he's got other things on his mind as well. Presidents seldom have the luxury of juggling a single crisis at a time. In Wilson's case, it's a major world war that breaks out and personal tragedy. He issues his appeal to the American people. The desire is to stay neutral and not drag the United States into the war. He said, quote, and I'm reading excerpts of it, "The people of the United States are drawn from many nations, and chiefly from the nations now at war. It is natural and inevitable that there should be the utmost variety of sympathy and desire among them with regard to the issues and circumstances of the conflict. Some will wish one nation, others another, to succeed in this momentous struggle." Then he gets to the point. "The United States must be neutral in fact as well as in name during these days that are to try men's souls. We must be impartial in thought as well as in action. We must put a curb upon our sentiments as well as upon every transaction that might be construed as a preference of one party to the struggle before another." So he's asking Americans to be neutral in thought as well as in deed. Think about that over the weekend, folks. And on Monday, we'll see